Okay, what I want to talk about is where do your bees go? That's a question we often have. Bees come back with pollen on their legs. We wonder where it's come from. One really great thing about bees is when honeybees go on a single foraging trip, they only go to one floral species. So when you see a bee on a flower with that color pollen on its legs, you know that that's what flower the bee's been at. So you can recognize that color often when you see the bees coming into the hive from then on. It's a really great way of learning. Unfortunately, there are a heck of a lot of shades of yellow, so it does take a little bit of guesswork in some cases, but it's a fun activity to do. And what I'm going to do is talk first about a list of plants that was prepared by Ontario beekeepers 30 years ago for a book called Plants for Beekeeping in Northeastern North America by Jane Ramsey. It may still be available. It's a really fantastic resource. So we'll go through these slides looking at pictures of images of what beekeepers feel are the most important plants, but then we're going to delve a little bit deeper and look into what our bees are actually working on. So here's number one. Have you all seen this flower out in your bee yard? I was out cutting just recently, and when I set my chainsaw down, there were all the bees collecting sawdust off the side of my chainsaw. So I have had bees collecting debris off burnt tires as well in bee yards. It's surprising what they'll go to when they're really desperate for pollen early in the spring. So number one, and what I'm showing these in order of appearance, like when we see them in the spring. So we've got willow, and there's a lot of different species of willow that bloom right from March through April and into May. So it's a bright yellow, and each of these slides will indicate what bees are collecting from these flowers. So they get both pollen and nectar from willow. Deciduous trees, I've lumped them together here because that's how Jane did it in her book. But there's quite a number of deciduous trees that bees work on, and we'll get into those a little bit more. But maple and black locust are shown here. The first pollen I generally see coming in the spring is from silver and red maples. They crossbreed into something called a Freeman's maple. So there's a third one in there, or hybridized, I should say. But it's a kind of a greenish yellow coming in the spring. And when we get a nice warm day in late March, we'll often see some pollen coming in. And it's been 2 weeks ago that we saw our first pollen coming in from silver and red maple. There you can see in the spring, I just love to see this. When you look out across the bush, especially in wetter areas, you'll see that bloom coming on, the red showing in the trees, all the flowers there. Norway Maple is another maple that's in late April, comes just before sugar maple. This is now considered an invasive species, but the bees really do work on this. There's a lot of it right around our home yard here, and so we see a lot of pollen coming in from them. Sugar maple blooms in early May, and if you don't have a lot of wind and the bees can get up high in the trees, there are some days where you can get an enormous amount of pollen coming in from sugar maple. For a while, we were collecting sugar maple for a fellow that worked in the medical field that needed isolated types of pollen. And we had 10 beehives making $135 an hour collecting pollen from sugar maple. We had to empty the pollen traps twice a day. There was so much pollen coming in from it. Black locust a little bit later in early June. It has just an amazing scent, and it's a very attractive plant for bees. In Europe, they call this acacia honey, because the Latin name for black locust is Pseudo acacia. It has a bit of a look of an acacia tree, but it's not. But if you hear of honey from Europe called Acacia honey, this is the plant it's coming from. Dandelion, real big one for us here, and it's so abundant in our environment. Bees get a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen, and a lot of us feel that our bees are kind of out of the woods in terms of survival once they get onto this dandelion. It really gives the colonies a jump start in the spring. Canola was number 4. Remember, this is 30 years ago this list was created. And canola was grown more abundantly in Ontario than it is now. And it does take a bit of a cooler climate. I find it interesting that Fergus, where I live, is an appropriate climate, but 25 minutes down the road in Guelph, it's not an appropriate climate because it's that much warmer. With swede midge and some other issues in the canola industry, there's not a lot of this, but where it is grown, it's often grown for breeding purposes, and so a lot of our beekeepers get some pollination income from pollinating the hybrid canolas. White Dutch clover. This, I think, is a really important bee plant. It grows abundantly whenever pesticides aren't used in lawns. So it does grow in areas that are mowed quite well. It doesn't do so well in areas that are unmowed. But it will bloom again and again and again, no matter how many times you cut it. And our whole university campus has white Dutch clover blooming in the spring. When I see those flowers come out, I think about the fact that the supers need to be on the colonies, because this is, when I see that, this indicates the start of our major nectar flow. It's not that everything is coming from that, but it's a really good cue that things are on the go. Basswood and linden trees, they're related. Basswood is native. Linden trees are from Europe. Linden trees are grown a lot in urban areas because they do well with pollution and an urban kind of environment. Basswood trees grow native, as I've mentioned, and they'll grow along the edges of bush lots and along fence rows. But it's a really great nectar source. Almost no pollen coming from basswood, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. Birdsfoot trefoil, a really important bee plant, kind of underrated in my opinion, and it grows voluntarily. You can see it growing on roadsides here. It grows in desperately dry situations. It's a really tough plant, nice and colorful, and if you start looking around, you'll see more of it. Many people aren't even aware what birdsfoot trefoil is, even though it's so abundant in our environment. Alfalfa, it's kind of hit and miss, whether you have alfalfa growing within flight range of where your bees are. We do have some of our yards close to this, and on the right year, we get a lot of nectar coming in from it, but zero pollen. Honeybees learn to work around the pollen tripping device, but the leafcutter bee that you can see on here is evolved to collect pollen on the under surface of their abdomen, so it's covered in hairs there, and the alfalfa flower trips and flips some pollen up at the bee's gut, and then off they go with some pollen and nectar. Honeybees don't like getting hit by the anther as it flips up, and so they lean in from the side and sip away at nectar, and they actually don't pollinate alfalfa or bring any pollen home from alfalfa. Milkweed's another great bee plant. You can see, maybe if you look closely, the bee that's in the air has pollinia, little pollen baskets dangling from its legs. So you might see little pollen sacs, I should say. So you might see some bees coming into your hives with these little pollinia on there. There's a kind of a notch in the flower that you can see, and occasionally bees get their feet caught in there. So you sometimes can see bees trapped in these flowers, but it is a really good source of nectar and pollen as long as they get away and get back to the hive. Goldenrod is a really important plant in our area, and it grows so abundantly in unmanaged lands. And we get a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen. I like to say it fattens our bees up for winter. And this is a really great source of, it's a secondary nectar flow. We'll often get up to a third of our total crop after the beginning of September, usually right after Labor Day weekend. Last year was a little bit later, but it takes temperatures in the 20s to get good nectar flow. So you don't always get that in the fall. So that's the numbers 1 through 10. I'm adding in some others that I feel are important. Viper's Bug Loss, what a cool name, huh? It blooms a long time, right from June until September. Really tough plant, grows in disturbed soils, dry areas, rough land, and it's a really great source for bees for a long period of time. Purple Loosestrife was a major nectar source at one point, and pollen, but some projects done here at the University of Guelph resulted in beetles being released to control this because it was felt to be an invasive plant. As beekeepers, we really liked it, but it's not that abundant anymore because the beetles did a really good job of taking care of that plant. Joe Pyeweed, another great plant, grows in river meadows, areas that are somewhat damp, likes sun though, and where if you're near river valleys, it can be a major source of pollen, or of nectar and pollen at a time of year where there's not a lot else blooming in August. So it's a great bee plant. Jewelweed, another August plant. These are kind of cool because when the bee flies into that flower, you can see the anthers sit above where the bee would go in, and they get a little stripe of pollen on the back of their thorax. Just like us, they can't scratch their backs very well. So you'll see that there's a little stripe of this pale yellow pollen on them, and you can say, aha, I know where you've been. So let's talk about some common flowers that can be grown in gardens. We all encourage people to do this in their backyard. It can make somewhat of a difference, and it's certainly really interesting to be able to see what bees are working on right in your backyard. But one tip is for honeybees, at least, you need to mass flowers. As I mentioned earlier, on one trip, they only go to one floral source, so one plant species. So if there's only one flower, they're not going to look at it. They need to go where flowers are massed together. And you can see that some flowers, some plants automatically do that, like the cloves in the foreground there. You get a mass of flowers on an individual plant. But trees and shrubs are another great way to mass flowers together. You plant the tree, it's there for the long term. There's a lot of flowers in a single plant, and that's a really effective strategy to help bees out. So I think we really should be focusing in some ways more on broader landscapes than just backyard gardens, and be thinking about what's growing in a lot of other areas. But let's go through these plants quickly. Crocus, one of the first ones in the spring. The crocus pollen is also, or at least the anthers, when they're collected, are that's what saffron is, just a point of interest. We see some of this orange colored pollen coming in the spring here at our home yard, which is in the city of Guelph, so our bees get to a lot of backyards. Grape hyacinth is another one. Sunflower is a fantastic flower to be growing, an annual. You can put them in wherever you want to add a bit of color, and lots of different bees work on that. Cosmos, we got two bees working together there. Anise Hyssop, it's thought to be one of the best bee plants out there, and you can see I'm trying to focus on flowers that don't just attract honeybees, but attract lots of other pollinators, like this beautiful swallowtail. Mountain Bluet, great garden flower, very commonly available. Goatsbeard, this one I've counted over 10 species of bees foraging at the same time on it in our backyard. Turtle heads really just attract bumblebees, but they're so cool because you can see the bumblebee crawling right into the flower. The flower will close up once the bee's inside. You can see the flower bobbing around as the bees working around inside there, and they're really fun to watch. Sedum, just about everybody has some sedum in their garden, and it automatically masses flowers, as you can see, and it's super attractive to bees. They'll work on it throughout September. So a couple late additions. I'm always watching what bees are working on in other people's gardens, and these are 3 plants that I'm seeing are really attractive to bees, and are the wild geranium and the wild bee balm are native plants too, but the wild geranium is very attractive. The wild bee balm, you can see, is a pink color, so it's Monarda fistula. But the red bee balm is Monarda didyma, and it is not attractive to bees. So don't plant the red bee balm that everybody has on their plant lists and then it grows in their garden for bees. Plant the wild bee balm, the pink one, and it's right from here. It does really well, and the bees just love it. Spiderwort's another great bee plant. That's just a tough, vigorous plant, and you can't go wrong with that one. Lots of herbs are attractive to bees, and they're beautiful in a flower garden or in a vegetable garden. So just a few here: lavender, mint, thyme, coriander. Coriander attracts a lot of little wee bees. And then there's lots of shrubs. Beauty bush and honeysuckle are shown here. I'm going to have to stop recommending honeysuckle because there are some species that are not invasive, but the Tartaria species is now considered to be invasive. So we're not going to recommend that one anymore. Weigela attracts a number of different bees, and of course the native sumac is a really good bee plant too. So trees, some that look nice in the backyard, or anything in the apple family, and catalpa trees are another beautiful plant to have around in your backyard. So now what I'm going to talk about is what our bees are actually working on based on many, many different samples that we've collected over the years and had analyzed by Melissa Girard in Quebec. And you can find her contact information on our website. There's some limitations in looking at what pollen is in honey because some plants end up being overrepresented. For example, forget-me-not, as you'll see in a minute. Some nectar is underrepresented with the amount of pollen that's present in it. And that includes basswood, linden, and as I mentioned earlier, bees don't get any pollen from alfalfa. So we really can't look at pollen in honey and determine what percentage of that honey has come from the pollen. But using pollen analysis in the honey samples does give you a pretty good indication of where your bees are working. So we're going to go through a few slides here. Not a lot to look at in terms of visual appeal, and I'd love to have some form of graphic representation, but this is for me, this still works pretty well. So there you can see we've got a whole list I'm going to be going through of different samples that came from this one bee area called Willowbee that we managed together with the tech transfer program for a number of years, just on the north side of Guelph. So we took honey samples throughout the summer. I'm only showing a few, but this one was May 21st. And you can see forget-me-not right at the top, 78.2%, but just forget-me-not because it's by far overrepresented there. So you can see buckthorn is a dominant plant that the bees are bringing nectar and pollen in from. And dandelion is just getting a start there, or actually we might be close to the end of that dandelion, but there's a little bit less of that. You can see some other very minor floral sources. June 28, getting into the main nectar flow time period there. Buckthorn is the dominant nectar represented there. And you can see Clover is just starting to come in, and Birdsfoot Trefoil as well. Right, July 5th. Now you can see that Birdsfoot Trefoil has moved up in that ranking, still behind Buckthorn, but coming up there. And Viper's Bug Loss is now coming in, and Basswood just a little bit as well. July 19th, Birdsfoot Trefoil is now the dominant source, and Buckthorn #2, Viper's Bug Loss, has come up a little bit. And then we're skipping ahead. I've skipped a few different samples here. We're skipping to September, and you can see that this would be honey that's come in earlier than that, from about early August until September. So it covers that time frame there. And Birdsfoot Trefoil is the dominant one, Joe Pyeweed being #2. Goldenrod just starting to come in there as well. Had we sampled a little bit later in the year, the Goldenrod would have been higher up on this list because it is so dominant. A couple other bee yards in different situations. This is one of our other yards, Crewson, and you can see how important, again, Birdsfoot Trefoil and Joe Pyeweed are there. This is our backyard here in 2007. And so you can see it's not always the same year to year. In this case, Clover was the #1 source. This was honey that was harvested at the end of the year, so it included everything coming in through the whole year. And in that particular year, Clover was the dominant nectar source. I meant throwing in a couple here just to make a few points. Here we can see Basswood at 10.9% of the pollen represented. Basswood, because there's so little pollen that comes from Basswood, anything over 10% Basswood pollen can be considered unifloral Basswood honey. It has that strong mint flavor to it, and very characteristic of both Basswood and Linden. And in this case, really that Basswood should be at the top if we're looking at where the nectar came from. So I'd like to just real briefly go to our website and so is our website showing there on the screen? Colette, can you comment there?
Yes, yeah, it's up.
All right, so here we are at the Honeybee Research Center website. I'm going to click on our Education and Events tab. And in there, then I'm going to click on Plants for Bees. And I'm doing this partly to show other people where to go to find some of these resources. So we click on Plants for Bees, and the first thing you see is our Bee-Friendly Garden brochure. So this is available for download to view, or we also sell these at our cost. So if you need some for an event or anything, just let us know. Information about how to plant for bees, things to keep in mind, and long lists of annuals, perennials, trees, shrubs, and herbs. Not a comprehensive list by any means, but it's a pretty long list that gives you lots of choice of plants to be planting. If we scroll down a bit, you'll see Nectar Trees, Shrubs, and Herbs of Ontario. This is the result of about 40 years of work done by a couple faculty members here on campus that retired back in the 1970s. But they did a lot of work on looking at what plants bees work on. Unfortunately, it's out of print, but you can download a copy on our website here. And it's not just for backyards, it's for any kind of plantings, broader landscapes and so on. It's a terrific resource. And then what I've done is updated that top 10 list that I showed you earlier to incorporate some of the information we've learned through the pollen analysis and through observations. And so this is what I feel are the top plants for bees in southwestern Ontario. Scrolling down a bit further, we've got links to many other sources of information for what bees are working on. And there's lots more you can find there. But get out there, watch what your bees are working on, and learn what you can as the season progresses. It's something I really enjoy, and I'm sure most of you do too.